Welcome to the Springs in the Desert podcast. We're those friends that you can take with you wherever you are on the path of infertility. Hello, and welcome back to the Springs in the Desert podcast. I am Jillian, your host for today's episode, and I am joined today by our contributor, Christina. How are you doing, Christina?
Good, Jillian, thanks.
Yeah, so good to talk to you. And we have a special guest today, Edward Luersman. How are you today, Edward?
I'm doing great, Jillian. It's good to be here with you.
Yeah, so I'm so grateful to have this conversation with both of you. I know it's going to be so good, and the Lord is going to speak so many truths through this podcast. I want to tell you a little bit about Edward. He lives with his wife, Kate, in Ohio, and is a licensed professional counselor with Spirit of Peace Clinical Counseling. That is such a beautiful name. I just have to throw that out there. I love that name. But as a Catholic and a counselor, his clinical focus includes support for individuals and couples experiencing infertility and miscarriage, which is such a gift to the world. And I'm excited to learn a little bit more about that. So, Edward, if you wouldn't mind just telling us a little bit more about yourself, maybe a little bit about your practice or about what your relationship is to Springs.
Yes, Jillian. So you mentioned my primary focus within counseling is to support individuals and couples with infertility and miscarriage. It's something I'm very passionate about and something I've really narrowed in on with my business. But I have to say it's very near and dear to my heart. Like you mentioned, I live with my wife, Kate, in the greater Columbus area in Ohio, and it's something that I've struggled with too, personally. And so 5 years of primary infertility and an experience of one miscarriage during the pandemic. So it was already on my radar because I had a lot of friends struggling with miscarriage before I even got married, but it's something that definitely intensified once I started to experience it personally. So I've just been very happy to allow this pain to then flow into supporting other people through that. So I work with couples and individuals in Ohio. Right now, licensure is really funny, and so I have a lot of issues with state boundaries. Hopefully we can work on that with some interstate contacts. But for now, I can help residents in Ohio. So if anyone's interested, they can reach out.
Yeah, that's so good to know. I appreciate those state boundaries, but sometimes I wish that they were a little more flexible so that we could allow more people to be served by those in other places. But yes, we do have many people in this community who live in Ohio, and so we'll make sure to include your contact information in the show notes so that they can reach out to you, or maybe even get a referral or something like that if they aren't so close to you. Yeah. And thank you so much for sharing about your personal experience too. I know that in order to be a good counselor, you don't have to have gone through the experiences that you're serving, the people that you're serving. But I know people in this community really, really appreciate when the professionals they're seeing can relate to them and really understand the crosses that they're carrying. Yeah, we are praying for you, and we are so thankful to have you in this community.
I was just going to ask a quick question. So, Edward, is it because of licensing issues you can't take clients via Zoom out of different states? Is that what?
Yeah, it's based on which state the client is in. So as soon as the client's in another state, then that state's laws and rules apply. In a lot of states, they say you have to have a Michigan license, you have to have a North Dakota license to work with a resident of that state. And I don't have those licenses.
Yeah, and I was just going to say with what Jillian had said, I'm sure now that you've especially with miscarriage, you've gone through it, I'm sure you can minister now to your clients in a way that's deeper than, before you had actually walked that path.
Yeah. It definitely helps with the empathy piece, that's for sure.
Earlier this morning, I was on a meeting with Anne, and we were talking to another counselor that we were just introduced to, and she had an experience of infertility and miscarriage and now adoption. And just the fact that the Lord gives us a variety of experiences, it allows us to just serve the body of Christ even better, and to, be his advocate with the Holy Spirit. So it's just and which I love, Spirit of Peace, clinical counseling, that name, because I think that really gives a direct focus on what the goal is. So I kind of want to dive right into that, actually, this idea of peace, because I think many of us in this community experience a lack of that when we're carrying the cross of infertility, or maybe we lose it often. And so I want to just ask you, Edward, in your professional experience and also your personal experience, what are some of the maybe emotions and thoughts that those carrying the cross of infertility or loss are carrying and share? Because I think that we can maybe think of ourselves as the only ones experiencing that thought or feeling. So I think it would be good to just talk about what are some of these common themes that you see.
Absolutely. There are countless words that could describe how people experience infertility, but some of the words that come to my mind are loss. I feel overwhelmed. I feel stressed. I feel scared. So you could find some words that really describe some of the uncertainty, the anxiety of the experience. There's also kind of more of the stress side of, the experience where I feel hopeless. I feel despair. I feel devastated by just the weight of my experience of loss, what infertility has taken away from me, or how I feel left out from community, from the next stage of my life, etc. So I definitely see more in that line. And then also too, anger, anger towards God, anger towards infertility, anger towards my body, a lot of anger or guilt, confusion. A lot of these things apply to infertility, to ourselves, to God, to those around us when other people aren't super sensitive. There's a lot of words that I would use to explain like kind of what I commonly encounter with infertility, but those are some of the big ones that I see.
Yeah, I can resonate with a lot of those, and I can see Christina shaking her head. Yep, yep, I can relate, and I kind of want to take that one step further. So that all of those emotions sound very, common and what people share in our community. How do you see those sort of affecting our day-to-day lives? Because I think I can be, perhaps feel angry, but that might look a certain way, in our marriages or in our professional lives. So what are maybe some ways that you have seen those emotions kind of affecting our day-to-day lives?
Well, what doesn't it affect? It affects everything, doesn't it? These emotions affect everything. It's hard to go about life when you're feeling devastated, when you're feeling overwhelmed, when you're feeling stressed, when you're feeling worthless, hopeless. It, and we just think about what are we trying to do on a daily basis? We're trying to work. We're trying to make, clean the house. We're trying to make meals. We're trying to keep up with all this stuff. But then we got to carry this heavy emotional weight too, right? Like it just adds so much burden and so much weight to everything we do. It makes it hard to just keep doing those things, those little mundane things. It makes it difficult to experience joy and hope in life, that kind of zest just kind of wears off, right? Like it just, the way that when we've been carrying it for so long, months, years, I think very much about how like worn down and how burnout people often feel. Clients very often feel battle weary. That's kind of a way that a lot of people describe it, but it just kind of robs you of a lot of the joy of living. And I can say that personally and professionally. And also it impacts our relationships. It changes a lot of dynamics too, doesn't it? It changes how we interact with family members. Maybe we struggle to be around family members who don't struggle with infertility, who are having a lot of kids. Maybe family members who aren't super sensitive to the struggles that we're encountering, not knowing how to help us, not able to. But even our relationship with God too. That, I see that so often, and we feel so guilty about it, but at the same time, it's like, but I do feel angry towards God. I feel angry towards Him and allowing this to happen to me and to my marriage and to my spouse. Like, I wish this didn't happen. If He's in control, why can't He just fix this? So, anyways, those are some of the things that come to my mind. What doesn't it impact is my question.
Yes, that is a great question. Christina, I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, I was just going to say, definitely resonated with a lot of that. It can paralyze us and just distract us, like you were saying, Edward. I felt that, like just the inability to live like in the present moment. And I don't know if you guys watch The Chosen, but I'm like super into it right now. But and then you feel guilty about all this time you wasted and that you weren't fully there. And I can't remember if it was like Philip was talking to Matthew in The Chosen, but Matthew was like, "Oh, I wasted all this time," and Philip was like, It's not time wasted. It was just misplaced, rearranged, but God will redeem it. And so I just, as an encouragement to our listeners, the Lord holds every tear and every suffering, and he will redeem it all. So don't feel guilty that you can't, live how you want to live right now,
That's such a good reminder that God, he does good with all things, for they work together for his good. But I think that's a really great place to sort of take our conversation about these relationships that you're talking about, Edward, because I personally can say, yep, with God, that's been a challenge with family members and friends, and not even that it's an intentional sort of conflict, that it just sort of happens because I'm in a different season than they are. And so maybe let's just start with God the Father. Now, I do want to make a disclaimer that I think is really important, that counseling is not the same as spiritual direction, and they are different disciplines and different fields, often really helpful to seek together and to, work on together. But as a Catholic man who serves, many, many Catholics, I'm curious if you have any thoughts about kind of like when some of these emotions affect our prayer life and our relationship with God the Father. What are some ways that we can enter that relationship or try to kind of work on that?
Yeah. And thank you for that disclaimer, Jillian. I appreciate that because, I'm not a spiritual director. I am not going to dive into the complexities of the spiritual life the same way that a good and holy priest or, some other spiritual director could. So thank you for that. I'm going to come at this from like a counseling relational standpoint.
Right.
Yeah. Well, what came to my mind with this question is just how important it is for us to first be aware of what it is that we are experiencing, like what are we feeling towards God, first and foremost. Like we can be aware of how this is impacting our relationship from our end with God. So what are we feeling towards God right now? What questions are popping up in your head? Are you thinking that God abandoned you? Are you thinking that God is punishing you? Are you angry at him? Are you frustrated? Are you wondering what is the purpose? Why me and not these other people? I think it's just really important first and foremost to be aware with how is this impacting my relationship with God? Or be able to articulate that first. I don't think we can really talk with God about it until we're fully aware. And maybe if we've been suppressing that, I find it's very common for faith-based clients to suppress that and say, well, I shouldn't feel that way. I shouldn't be having these thoughts. And so we just got to be careful about that. So first and foremost, I'm giving you permission, listeners, to acknowledge your feelings and to feel them. Allow yourself to just acknowledge them and sit in them for a little while before we even take them to God first. But you can see where I'm going with this next. The next thing I would recommend is then let's talk with God about it. Like any relationship, if we got this conflict going on, we need to bring it up. It's the elephant in the room. Like if we're saying all our other prayers and doing everything, it's just still this big elephant in the room that's just following us around. So I think God can handle it. I think he can handle it if we need to go talk to him about these feelings that we've articulated to ourselves. So let's then share with him how you feel. Speak from the heart and really process that with him. Like any good relationship, it's a two-way street. So maybe we can start out with us sharing and giving our emotions over to him and our questions. Then I think we also need to then listen, maybe encounter him through adoration, through contemplative prayer, through reading the scriptures. The chosen, I love that you've mentioned that. I love that you mentioned that, Christina, because that's been on my mind too, the chosen, and how like the Lord was speaking through that series, and I wasn't expecting him to, but yeah, there was some stuff in there too that really spoke to me. So yeah, speak to the Lord, the relationship, share with him, and then maybe look at how can I allow the Lord to speak to me and reveal some things to me about the struggle.
That is a really helpful process that you just laid out. And as you said, for me anyways, I think I complicate it because it's God that I am talking to. And I make it more. And even though, I mean, yes, our relationship with God is so, so, so important. It's a relationship. He's a person that I can talk to. And I love what you said, sort of first just gather your thoughts. I'm thinking of conversations that I have with my husband that I haven't really thought through. And I just start talking and talking and talking. And now all of a sudden I've been talking for 20 minutes and I'm going in circles and I haven't really made my point and he's frustrated. And of course, God can see into our hearts better than a human can. But I just love that idea of, gather your thoughts, bring them to the Father and listen. And then just all those ways that you provided that are listening tools. There's so many ways that God can speak to us through scripture, through prayer, through things like The Chosen, or even other people, that he might, I'm kind of stubborn in prayer. And so sometimes the Lord has to kind of tell me something several times in a book I'm reading, a friend will tell me it, I hear it on the radio, I see a commercial, he just has to tell me like in 10 different ways before I say, okay, I hear you, because he can use all things. So I really appreciate that kind of process about if you're struggling in prayer, if you're struggling with your relationship with God, here's just kind of a simple way that I think is also pretty relatable to any relationship, as you said, just like any good relationship, kind of follow these steps. And I think that that's a tender spot in some of our listeners' hearts is some of their relationships with earthly fathers. That might be maybe their biological father. It could be a pastor, or maybe just some other father figures in their lives, uncles or neighbors, things like that. And I think that those tender wounds and spots can exist for, a variety of reasons. But, I'm wondering if you think it's possible or if it's helpful to start kind of restoring our relationship with God the Father, and if that is helpful to then, kind of restore our relationship with some of our earthly fathers.
Absolutely. I think first, if we're able to be in union with God, he can give us so much grace and so much clarity through our prayer, through our relationship with him. Give us guidance on how do we navigate this situation or that situation. You're referencing specifically, like, what do I do with difficult relationships or challenging relationships? I think it's pretty, evident that, God's giving you guidance with that can really help with that. I do think too, I'm going to take this on a more counselor bent here, where I think with God as Father, there's a natural connection between our relationship with him as Father and our relationship with, men on earth as Father. And so a lot of times we can see God the Father through the lens of our earthly fathers. And it can be helpful maybe to go in reverse, recognizing that, hey, God the Father is perfect. We don't understand it. It feels like maybe he's a tyrant, or maybe it feels like he's ignoring us, negligent, but in reality, he is perfect and all loving. And there's some reason we don't understand it, but there's some reason why we're going through this. And so understanding him as the perfect Father can then help us to approach other relationships, recognizing that, hey, these are human relationships, they're imperfect relationships. It can help kind of set the expectations for that. Maybe we need to lean in God the Father more if we're having issues with other human relationships.
I really appreciate that comment, because that is actually something I noticed in my own prayer life and in my own reflection, that I was looking at God sort of from the earth up. I was looking at him through my thoughts of fatherhood on earth. Yeah, sort of seeing frustrations or flaws, or, just, I've asked you for this and you haven't given this to me, just, sort of in that way, rather than looking at my earthly father or fathers from, heaven down, and trying, because I think too, sometimes I have a misunderstanding of who God the Father is, and also who my earthly fathers are. I think sometimes I expect my earthly fathers to be more like God the Father, and I sort of blame God the Father for the things that aren't his fault, necessarily, that like he's not doing something, he might be allowing something. And so that was something that was really helpful for me to see my earthly father through the eyes of God the Father, and kind of reclaim some of those maybe personality traits or things that I experienced when I was younger, to kind of see it through God the Father's eyes. And so I really appreciate that. Maybe reverse it, look at it the other way. Yeah, Christina, I'm curious if you, can relate to that in any way, about kind of just misunderstandings about maybe God the Father, our earthly fathers, and what you think about
Yeah,
that.
I mean, pretty much echo what you guys said, but I think it also, and I'm not going to segue too much, but your spouse, expecting your spouse to be Jesus for you, and then you put these like super high expectations on them, and of course they're not going to fulfill those. I mean, they're human. So yeah, the same way goes to God the Father, our earthly fathers, our earthly mothers. Like, thank God we have God the Father who's perfect, and we have Mother Mary. A lot of people have issues, issues with their biological moms. So it's nice that even though they're not perfect, we do have perfect parents. And I know, Jillian, maybe this is when you want to segue to like pastors, especially. We expect and we like hope, our pastors are like these perfect people, but they're just human. And to remember that, they're not always going to say the right things, but they're often just trying their best, and just to forgive them when they're not saying the best things or giving the best advice. But I don't know if you want to segue to the pastor's part now.
Yeah, that would be great. I think that's a really logical kind of next step is that the other fathers that many of us experience are pastors in our parishes, in our churches, and especially around things like Mother's Day or Father's Day. And maybe if we hope that they would have maybe handled those days a little differently or would have acknowledged us a little differently, there can be a lot of difficult wounds, or maybe we've even had conversations with them about it and they haven't received us so well. Maybe that it would be helpful, Edward, for just maybe a couple practical conversation starters or something that we could say, in this case to our pastors, but maybe even our earthly dads. What are some ways that we could maybe start talking to them about this cross?
Absolutely. So you'll recognize that there's going to be some similarity with how I was describing expressing yourself to God the Father. So that's intentional. But I think, especially if you ever read that the person, your pastor, or the person you're trying to share with is a responsive and receptive person, somebody who's going to accept your emotions and your experience well, I would encourage you to try to pattern that same process of, here was my experience when, this thing happened on Mother's Day at my parish. This is how it made me feel. Or this is what I could use to be helpful for, me and anybody else who's struggling with infertility in your life. Expressing your feelings, your needs in a gentle way. Don't come across like, you do this to me and, you're an awful person, but really trying to simply say, it's hard for me. I feel left out. I feel excluded. And then we really kind of share that and see if the person is responsive, the pastor is responsive, and see if you can collaborate on how you can make that better for you. I mean, my biggest comment would be, you just gotta get a read. Because unfortunately, because we're talking about imperfection and just kind of like the brokenness of our human existence, not every person is going to be super responsive, super receptive to any of this kind of thing. It does take some comfort level with uncomfortable emotions to be able to receive that kind of stuff. So some people may not be comfortable even going in this kind of deep territory. So I guess with people, with pastors, with other people who are not as responsive, not as receptive emotionally, then you have to kind of look at, well, what is a reasonable expectation for this relationship, for this situation, because they're not all going to be created equal. And you might have to outsource more of that to God the Father and say, I know that this person's not going to give me what I want in this situation. So God, I hand that over to you, and I'm not going to try to force it out of them.
Yeah, that's helpful. I appreciate your comment about reasonable expectations. That is a good check for me because I think it's likely that I put unreasonable expectations, perhaps as Christina was sharing, on my spouse or even the various earthly fathers that I have, pastors that especially, I could see that if this is the first time they're hearing from someone about infertility, it's probably a little bit difficult for them to navigate. Maybe they've never thought about it before. And I know when someone points out something that maybe I didn't notice, sometimes I get a little defensive, or sometimes I want to say, no, that I didn't forget, or, I just seeing how I respond. I can see that could be how someone else also responds to the first time they're hearing something. So, yeah, what's a reasonable expectation? And I also love this idea of outsourcing to God the Father, that He hears us And he is working in everyone's hearts. So there are things that he can say to someone that maybe we even can't, that we're not able to express, that he can just sort of whisper into their hearts. And yeah, that's really helpful. I think that to echo what you said about God the Father, try to do the same thing with our earthly fathers, but to just know that we're all imperfect and we're all trying, especially in this community of Catholics and Christians who are trying to be the best versions of themselves and to imitate Christ, that to assume the best, in people. And if they happen to have an encounter that's a little bit hurtful, or maybe a lot hurtful, that we have God the Father, who's a perfect Father and loves us where we are. Edward, thank you so much for being here on this episode and for sharing your insights. I learned a lot. I'm going to be taking this to prayer and into my other relationships. And I just want to, reiterate to our listeners that we'll make sure to put your contact information in the show notes so that they can reach out to you, because, I think you'd be a great, great resource for those in Ohio.
Yeah, and anybody can reach out to me if they still want to just talk about their experience or get some guidance on some resources in their area. And who knows, maybe the rules will change in the future, and I might, that may change. So anyways, anybody can reach out to me if they're still inclined.
Thank you, Edward. That is so helpful. And we appreciate your openness and willingness to serve those who are carrying this cross, because it's a tender and heavy cross. And you're such a valuable member of this community. So I am so excited for this episode to be shared, and for this community to just get to know you a little bit more, and also to hopefully kind of re-enter and reclaim some of these fatherly relationships. Listeners, I know that our relationships with God the Father or earthly fathers can sometimes be challenging, but I hope if you get one thing out of this podcast, is that God the Father loves you and he is perfect and wants the best for you. And we are here walking with you along that journey. And just know we're praying for you, and we see you. And we just really hope that and pray that your relationships with your fathers begin to restore. And know that too, that we're always here, as Edward said, that he's here to chat, and we're walking with you. So we'll see you next time. Thank you so much for joining us for this Springs in the Desert podcast episode. We would be so grateful if you took a minute to rate and review us so that we can reach more listeners. Don't forget to check out our social media pages on Facebook and Instagram, and go to our website, springsinthedesert.org, where you can sign up for our newsletter and community prayer list, read our blog, and register for virtual and in-person events. Most importantly, remember that God loves you so much, and so do we.